Welcome to the Oxford Clay Pottery podcast. I'm Catherine Tomlinson and I founded an eco-conscious pottery company called Oxford Clay. Now, I don't just make pottery, I make resources such as books and courses for other potters who want to be more eco-conscious in their pottery practice. And that's what this podcast is all about. It's about me sharing everything I've learned with you, and I can't wait to get started. Let's go. Hello, so before we get on with the episode, I wanted to tell you about two completely free guides that I've made just for you about pottery. And the first guide is called How to Make a Pottery Glaze. So if you've ever been curious about how to make your own pottery glaze, this guide will show you exactly how to make your own glaze from start to finish. It tells you all the ingredients you need. It tells you step by step how to make the glaze, how to stay safe when glaze making, and it's got a stoneware glaze recipe in there. And if you've been curious about how to fire pottery, I have also made a guide on electric kiln firing. So this guide will tell you all the different terms that's used in like kiln firing, and what they mean, and it also takes you through the exact firing schedule that I use to do my bisque firing and also stoneware glaze firing. So it's got all the temperatures in there, all the timings in there, and both of these guides are available from the Oxford Clay website at www.oxfordclay.co.uk/resources for potters. Okay, let's get on with the episode. Hi everyone, welcome back to the Oxford Clay Pottery podcast. It's really nice to be back here with you all, and in today's episode I'm going to talk to you about something called Verdigris. So you might not have used Verdigris or heard of Verdigris. You might have heard it in a kind of colloquial term. Maybe you've heard about like the colour, or you've heard about copper having verdigris, say like the top of a roof, a copper roof, but you've never heard about it in relation to pottery before. So I wanted to just talk to you in this episode all about verdigris, because it's something that I actually use in my pottery. I use it regularly. I use it for pretty much all my pottery, to colour my pottery. And it's been like a revelation for me in terms of being able to make it myself, being able to make it from recycled metal, and the different ways I've used it. And I thought it might be a really good thing to talk about on an episode, because I've been experimenting quite a lot with how to use it in different ways and how to make it. And so I want to tell you all about verdigris. So the first thing is really just to tell you about what verdigris actually is. So I looked this up in officially from the concise Oxford Dictionary of Art Terms, because verdigris is actually an ancient pigment that's been used for thousands of years. So this is what the concise Oxford Dictionary of Art Terms says about verdigris. So it says it's a light bluish green pigment made of hydrated copper acetate. One of the earliest artificial pigments, it was made by the Greeks and Romans, but eventually abandoned in the 19th century due to its instability in reaction to other pigments and to the atmosphere. So I think what that's referring to is in terms of painters using it, and they would use it to, some very famous painters hundreds of years ago used verdigris to create green basically in their work. So another way of thinking about verdigris is that it's kind of like a form of copper carbonate. So if you've used commercial metal oxides, that you've bought from the pottery supplier, you might have bought copper oxide, which is quite a strong colourant used in pottery, or you might have bought copper carbonate. You might have used copper carbonate, which is a slightly less strong sort of green, and could create red as well in a reduction atmosphere pigment that you can use it in your work. So verdigris is basically just another form of using a copper pigment in your pottery practice. So the ways in which I've used it in my practice are that I've used it both in glazes and I've used it on top of glazes. You know, say like if you were painting something like in the way that you would normally use an oxide, a metal oxide, you know, mixing it maybe with a bit of water and painting it on top of a glaze. So those are the two ways that I've used it. I've never actually mixed it into clay before. So, you know, I know that that is something that some potters do. They like mix metal oxides into clay to colour clay. I've never used verdigris in that context, but yeah, I'll tell you about the other two ways that I've used it. So the first thing to say before we get on to like how I use it is like how I actually make it, because you might think it's something that's like, you know, something that you can't do yourself, or that it's going to take you ages, or, you know, that it's not accessible to you. But I'm here to tell you it is absolutely accessible to you. So the way I make it is I actually make it from old copper. So the best way, the most reliable way I've found in terms of getting old copper is to use old electric cables that are no longer used. So what I actually do is I get my cables from local charity shops, and what happens is people donate, they donate things to the charity shop that don't actually work, or when they get tested, you know, they get the PAT, there's this thing called PAT test, and you know, if they fail the PAT test, which is a kind of test of electrical safety, then they won't be able to sell those things really, and so they end up with huge amounts of kind of electrical waste. And so I went into my local charity shop, which is kind of, it's a I don't know, if you're not from the UK, you might not know what a charity shop is, but basically it's a way of, you know, you donate goods to them, and then other people buy those goods. So it's like you give them goods, and then it's a great way of them, they make money off the free, you know, the goods that people have donated, and also you get some cool stuff, you know, if you're like shopping in the charity shop. So so went into the charity shop and they said, do you have any like, you know, electrical waste that you don't want? And they just gave me all this electrical waste. They said they do recycle it, you know, they do recycle it for scrap, but I gave them more money than they would get from just selling it as scrap. So what I do then is I take the casing off the wire, and I had to say I have watched quite a few YouTube videos on like watching people do this and like how they do it, and trying to get some like tips and stuff, because when I first started doing it, it took me ages. I was sort of, you know, I was like very carefully cutting. Some of the cases are quite like tough to get through, so I would be like cutting it with a Stanley knife, and it was taking me a really long time. And so my first top tip in terms of verdigris is, if you think you might want to make like quite a lot of it, I think you want to use it regularly in your pottery, you think you might need a lot to, say, like colour a glaze, if you're making a pottery glaze, then I would really recommend investing in something that takes, like a little machine that takes the casing off wire. So I just got a machine which is a hand operated machine, so it's kind of a manual machine, and I basically turn a handle, and then it uses this kind of like blade to like chop the wire casing off it. You kind of feed the wire in and you turn the handle and it cuts the casing off, and that's a really good way of like getting the casing off a lot of wire quite quickly. So then what I do is I take all my copper wire and I kind of make it into a kind of nest type shape, and I put it in a bowl, and then I spray it with vinegar and salt. And what that does is it starts off the natural oxidation process that would happen anyway. If you just left that copper, you would get verdigris on it, on the outside of it eventually, because it's something that would naturally happen in the atmosphere. You know, like I was saying to you at the start, like if you think about some kind of buildings, you know, with that like beautiful green roof, or say like, you know, a bronze statue, or, you know, that you might see out in town or something that's got all that green, sort of green on it, that's verdigris. That's the natural pigment just happening, creating in the atmosphere. So what you're doing is you're essentially like speeding up that process. So I mean, that kind of takes a few days to make the verdigris and you know, oxidize in the atmosphere. And then what I do is I wait until it's dry, and then I crumble off the verdigris. So at this point, I'm wearing my FFP3 face mask, which I do mention a lot on this podcast. But you really do need, like to protect your lungs when you're working with any powders. I know I've said it before and stuff, but it's really, really important. So, I have my face mask on, and I crumble off the verdigris. I use gloves as well, and then it goes into like this kind of green powder. So you've got this beautiful bright green powder, and that is your verdigris pigment. So sometimes if it's like come off in like big lumps and stuff, I will crush it up in a pestle and mortar, and you can also sieve it if you want a really, really fine powder. It's a good idea to make sure there's no actual pieces of copper in your verdigris. That can happen if you're using wire, because so maybe a little tiny bit of wire breaks off or something. But just try and what I do is I try and sort of sieve out the pieces of metal, because you don't really want the metal in your glaze. It kind of like will melt in the kiln and stuff. So you just want the verdigris. So that's basically it. And then I do the same process again. So I'll like spray it again with a bit of vinegar and salt, and then it, starts off the oxidization process again. And then add a bit more wire if I need to, and just carry on making verdigris that way. And just to say, you can make a lot of verdigris with not that much wire. But, if you are making a lot, like I said, it's a great idea to get something to help you just take those wire casings off. You can also use other scrap copper. If you have other scrap copper available, then that's fantastic. But I just found that electrical waste was a really good way of like using up electrical waste, taking it off the hands of the charity shop, but also, and like I can pay them as well for it. But it's also a really accessible way to get copper. If you're not really sure, like, where do I get copper from? You can recycle it yourself from wires. So there we go, right, so you've got your verdigris as a powder. So how do I actually use it? Okay, so the first way I use it is I mix it with a little bit of water and sometimes a little bit of my ash glaze that I use on all my pottery. And I then paint it onto a design like on the pot, so directly on the pot. So the pot has been glazed. So in exactly the same way, if you think about, say, like, some potters would do this, where they would dip a pot in like maybe like a tin glaze or something, and then they would paint on oxides, which they would mix with water. That's a really typical way of decorating pottery, especially sort of earthenware pottery. You get that beautiful kind of red clay with the white glaze, and then you'll see like designs painted in a metal oxide, or you can paint it on pretty much any glaze, as long as it's going to show up the color. So I have a kind of really lovely ash glaze, which is kind of almost colorless. Sometimes get like little bits of blue, little bits of white in it, just from the wood ash. So there's no colour in that glaze at all. And I would dip my pot in the ash glaze, and then I would just dip my brush into some verdigris, which I've mixed with a little bit of water, a little bit of glaze sometimes, or a little, maybe even just water, and paint it on top. So you get the powder, verdigris powder, mix it with water, paint it on top of a design. And what happens is, because that glaze is high in flux, and in the kiln it sort of really melts all the it kind of goes kind of runny, and all the verdigris powder like melts into the glaze, and you just get this beautiful design of green. Basically, it sort of turns that immediate design that you've painted the verdigris on this beautiful green glaze. So that's a really good way. It's a good economical way as well of using verdigris, because you're not having to make like loads and loads and loads, but you're still getting that colour in your pottery. So I would highly recommend that. And that's basically the standard way that I make my pottery. That's how I make the colour in my pottery. I was just going to show you a bit actually. So if you're watching on the video, let me just show you one. So this is a dragonfly dish, so just to try and illustrate exactly what I'm talking about. It's if you're listening on the podcast, I'll just describe it for you. It's a round dish with a dragonfly in the middle, and then the dragonfly in the middle it's got verdigris on its wings and body. And it's kind of gone into a kind of light green. It's this beautiful light green colour. Just holding it right up to the camera. So it's like a kind of, you don't get a very strong colour doing it that way, It's just this beautiful touch of green. It's absolutely lovely, and it works really well, I'd say, with ash glazing. So that's one way of using it. And okay, the next way of using verdigris is to actually mix it into a glaze. So what I'd say about this is that so I've been experimenting. I've been experimenting with adding verdigris to glazes, and what I'd say is you do need quite a lot. So you would have it at a higher concentration than other metal oxides. So say, for example, copper carbonate, you might put that in at a concentration in a glaze of maybe, I don't know, 1.5%, maybe up to 3% or something. But verdigris, I started at 5% because I knew that it was like quite a weak colourant, and I actually went up to 10%. So I tested some at 10% of a glaze, and I tested some at 5% of a glaze. And the 10% ones, I'm gonna just tell you, it didn't really work because I think the colour was just too strong. I think the verdigris kind of affected the kind of integrity of the glaze. So I got this very weird effect on lots of the glazes I tested, where it kind of went into this kind of very patchy glaze where some bits were like glazed and some bits weren't. It really affected the kind of quality, the integrity of the glaze. So I would say just like my top tip for that is maybe 10% is too much. Another problem with using 10% is you do need a lot. So I actually made it a lot of verdigris from wire, and I had it all in this bowl, and I was using a lot. I was thinking, this is not a very economical way to use verdigris, especially because it does take you a few days to make, so so I think 10%, my conclusion is that's probably a bit much. But then other glazes, so the ones that like 5%, they did make a really beautiful green glaze. So the colours range from a kind of beautiful turquoise to a kind of light grassy green, a lovely kind of fresh grassy green, and then I had another glaze which was like a kind of beautiful kind of sage colour, like a lovely light green sage colour, and that was just depending on the base glaze I used. So what I did was I just switched it up in terms of different base glazes, just made with different ingredients like just very standard glaze ingredients. They like china clay, feldspar, quartz, all of those ingredients were used. One had whiting in it, one had dolomite in it, a combination of all those ingredients. And then I added the 5% or the 10% of verdigris on top. So yeah, I would really recommend trying out verdigris. I think probably the most accessible way of trying it is just making a little bit with some scrap copper, and then using it just with a bit of water to paint on your pottery. And I think, yeah, I'd really recommend it because it's a lovely shade of green. You get these, it's a very, very nice shade. It's like a kind of bluey turquoisey kind of light green. It's a fantastic way of colouring your pottery in a way that's quite eco-conscious, because you're recycling metal, and you're not having to rely on those commercial metal oxide supply chains, which can be hard to trace. They can have artisanal mining in. They are, taking those natural resources from the earth. It's a primary product where they're having to mine the ore, make the metal oxides from that ore. So you're kind of using something that's already in the supply chain, and you're kind of turning it back into a colourant. So yeah, I've had so much fun with verdigris, and I've had so much fun talking to you about it as well. And I think my verdigris experiments will probably carry on continuing. Just before I finish, actually, I've just realised I haven't told you about a couple of things that kind of top verdigris tips, really. So I did tell you about the fact that that verdigris is quite a weak colourant, but there is another thing that happens sometimes with verdigris where it can burn out at very high temperatures. So I always fire my pottery to stoneware temperatures, and what I found is sometimes the dishes in the very top of the kiln can be lighter in colour than the ones at the bottom of the kiln, which is maybe a bit cooler. So the steps I've taken to kind of try and manage that are I've actually lowered the soak time of my pottery, which is the time where it's kind of soaking at that very high temperature, where the kiln is maintained at the very top temperature, which is 1260 degrees Celsius. I have like reduced that. I've reduced that by a minute, which doesn't sound a lot, but actually it did make a really big difference. I think I used to have it like 17 minutes and I was finding the colour was really burning out, and I reduced it to 16, and then more recently I've reduced it to 15 minutes. So what I do now is I just soak it for 15 minutes at that very high temperature, and that does seem to still, melt the glaze adequately. The glaze is still mature, but the verdigris is burning out less. And then another weird thing that happened to me the other day when I was testing all these verdigris glazes was that I had the verdigris glazes at the very bottom of the kiln, and then the pots at the very top of the kiln. So I'm not like a chemist, so I don't know what exactly happened in the kiln. Sometimes, it's very mysterious what happens in the kiln anyway, and we'll never really know what happens in kilns. You kind of just open it and some random stuff has happened quite often. But in this particular firing, the pottery at the top of the kiln was completely colourless. So I don't know whether that's something to do with the fact that like at the base of the kiln there were these very strong verdigris pots, where the verdigris was very, very strong, a very strong colour, and the concentration was very high because they were the 10% and the 5% glaze tests. But the glazes at the top of the kiln, the verdigris, and it was just where at the verdigris at the top of the kiln, that was where I just painted it on, and they'd completely disappeared. The green had completely disappeared. So that's another kind of like just thing to tell you in terms of like, my experience of verdigris. That I think something strange perhaps can happen in a kiln if you're testing very strong concentrations of verdigris. Your other pottery, might be affected basically. So that's just something to tell you. But yeah, thank you so much for joining me on this episode, and I'll continue to update you of any more experiments I'm doing. I think my next kind of phase of experimentation is probably going to be into rust and using rust to colour pottery, because again, that's a freely available metal oxide that you can make yourself, that you can get some really interesting colours with. So I've got this very orange rust actually I've found, and I've been scraping it off with my face mask and so I'm excited to kind of experiment with that. It's my next sort of phase of experimentation. But yeah, until then, until the next episode, wishing you really happy potting, and thank you so much for joining me on this episode, and I'll see you soon. Bye. Thank you so much for joining me for the Oxford Clay Pottery podcast. If you're interested in learning more about Oxford Clay or eco-conscious pottery, there's so much for you on the Oxford Clay website. There's books, e-courses, there's a blog on there, loads of other podcast episodes, and I can't wait to share it with you. The web address is oxfordclay.co.uk. I'll see you over there.